Oh, I forgot my bell. So ding, ding, ding. Yeah, so I forgot that. I knew I forgot something. Well, good morning. Welcome, welcome. So going around, I think, is the refreshment list, and I think the prayer pad as well. And I know Betty sent out the email for the prayer list yesterday, and so you can either jot it down on the list or you can send one in electronically, and then, of course, Betty will take it and put it all together, compile both lists, and send them out. Normally, I think it's tomorrow morning. So if you're watching, Betty, thank you very much for doing that. Appreciate you taking care of that. I know it's helpful for me to obviously think about those that are in our community that definitely we want to remember in our prayers. So just be mindful of that. And a couple of announcements. Just want to remind you again about the screw tape letters. That's something that John Few and Gil McBride are doing on Sundays during the Sunday school class. I think it's going to be a 6-week sort of endeavor, kind of walk through parts of the screw tape letters, and they're looking at it thematically more than anything else. This week, it's going to be chapters 12 and 13. And the chapters are very small. Sometimes it's just like a page and a half. But that's going to be the subject matter. It'll be 10 o'clock in the fellowship hall. Mm-hmm. Sure. So it's going to redeem the, the Great Divorce? Or the Problem of Pain. It's going to redeem the Problem of Pain. That's the one that we like so much here. So they're not videoing it. They are making an audio copy, and that's going to be on St. Paul's podcast. The issue is that so the way that works is you have to apply to get your information on the podcast and then to be distributed like through Apple or Google or whatever it may be. We don't know when they'll approve it. So, sometimes that's also the truth. It's also like with our services, particularly if there's something that either Apple or Google or the distributors, the platforms believe is copyright infringement. So we have to walk through and explain why it's not. And but John, I did ask John about that. This week has been submitted. When we finally get approval, then it'll go up. But I don't know when the date will be. But it will be archived. I mean, it will be on our St. Paul podcast. So hang on, Teresa sent me a note. So maybe it. So someone's already said, when someone asks a question, will I repeat the question? So the question is, the screw tape letters, are we making videos of it? And the answer to that is no, but we are making audio copies of it so that you can listen in the form of a podcast. As for when that will be on our platform, that we don't know. We're waiting on approval from the platforms themselves. And once that happens, then it'll go up. So, all right. Any other questions about screw tape? What is it, Uncle Screw Tape in Wormwood? Is that it? Yeah. So here's what y'all need to do. Which one is Screw Tape and which one is Wormwood, John or Gil? So I think that's what we need to decide so that next week we can sort of kind of give them their proper titles. So also, so just FYI, and you don't have to read the chapters before. That's okay. They also have some handouts that have to do with like character descriptions in the stories and some of the basic themes and tenets. So there, even if you just want to come and just participate just on the Sunday morning, that's fine as well. But if you all want to read ahead, that's chapters 12 and 13. March the 29th. Does anybody know what takes place here on Wednesday, March the 29th? The Easter egg hunt. That's right. So the reason why I mention that is, one, we need candy, those eggs, the pre-filled eggs. But just don't be late. I mean, y'all know how it goes here at St. Paul. When Grace or Jess or me or whomever, when the bell sounds, they hunt. And yeah, exactly right. So if you want those pictures of your granddaughter or grandson or whatever it may be hunting, if you don't want them crying, get here on time. So but just be mindful of that. And then of course, want to invite you to supper that night as well, and we're just going to have some little fun activities afterwards. So, but that's March 29th. For us here at St. Paul, March the 15th and the 22nd. Those are also Wednesdays. During Wednesday night supper, and I'm probably will start at about 6:15ish or 6:20, just so that we'll have an adequate amount of time. I want to walk those that are there through just some information that has to do with our denomination and some of the ways that might or might not affect local congregations. Some of that has to do is just reminding us about how the Methodist Church operates with their polity, and then what's been going on for the last couple of years. And so just if one person from your family could come either on the 15th or the 22nd, that would be ideal. It's going to be the same meeting, and so it's not like whatever's talked about on the 15th, there's going to be something else that's talked about on the 22nd. This won't be the only one, so if you can't make those, this is just the ones that'll take place in the spring, and then obviously not long after this, we'll be into Easter, and then after that, we're pretty much ready for the summer. Easter is a little bit late this year, and so people begin their kind of summer break. I'll also be making the rounds in Sunday school classes or small groups, things like that, to answer any questions. But just the lines portion of just some basic information would be helpful on the 15th and 22nd. So do want to remind you of both of those 2 dates. I think that's it when it comes to announcements, unless I'm missing something that y'all know of. All good? All right, excellent. So before we pray and jump into the text, we finished Daniel. Thanks be to God, right? That man alive. That just, those books they get heavy at the end, don't they? So it doesn't matter what we're studying. By the end of we finish a book. I'm tired of every book by the time we get to the end, right? So, but since we're sort of hamstrung a little bit on our calendar, I don't think we have enough weeks to jump into something that we can't finish within the span of about 6 or 7 weeks. And so what I mentioned last week, and this is what we're going to do, is since it's Lent, we're going to look at the 7 last sayings of Jesus. And so this is going to be our calendar. Now, I've only listed the verse itself where Jesus is speaking. It's going to be a wider portion of Scripture. But this is going to be the flow to where we're going. If you want to read ahead, there's just a couple of dates that I don't know. Like on April the 11th, all South Georgia clergy have to attend ethics, conference on ethics every so often. And so this year we're changing something in our annual conference. So every clergy has to attend 1 or 2 different conferences. And so I think John and I might be attending the same one. If not, I know I'm attending the one on April the 11th. If John is not attending one or the same one, then he might fill in here, or we might have to cancel just because it's a mandatory conference that we have to attend that has to do with clergy ethics. And then, this one, Luke 23:46. Yeah, sorry, 23. That's Luke 23:46. I'll also be out of town this week, so John might fill in. If not, it might not be Luke 23. That might be May the 2nd. But we normally go to the second week of May. So somewhere in the first or the second week, we'll have our last meeting, and then, of course, we'll break for the summer and move on into the spring. That being said, I want your, take, and if you're at home, same thing. You can email myself or Betty, and then Betty can give it to me, or Kathy, that'd probably be better. If there is something that you're interested in studying, Mimi, you don't get to pick this time, right? So for the fall of next year, don't hide it to yourself. Don't keep it to yourself. Feel free to we'll make a list and then kind of determine. I know we've done, normally we try to do a gospel lesson, a New Testament book, and then an Old Testament book, and then maybe another book that's non-canonical, not tied to Scripture. Since we are doing something like Screw Tape to some degree, I know some are participating, that might be good enough. Have we done Luke in here? I thought we did. I know we've done Mark, and I know because Mark was the first book 11 years ago. I do know that. Yeah, we did Luke, Matthew, and John. We did Matthew, Mark, and John. I wasn't sure if we did the Gospel of Luke. But, after a while, some of this runs together for me, right? So, but anyway, I couldn't find it in my notes. And so if that's the case, then perhaps Luke we could go back to one of the Gospels. If not, if there's another book of the Bible you want to study, happy to do that as well. So just maybe over the next week or two, put some thought into that, and we can kind of collectively decide. If you don't have any desires around either one, then I'll just pick and we'll kind of go on with it. So, but if there is something that you want to, if you've always wanted to study or think about, happy to do it. But this will probably be the schedule that we'll follow. Just remember April, the week of April the 4th, 3rd, 4th, that's Holy Week, and we'll have Holy Week lunches every day, so Monday to Thursday. Instead of a Maundy Thursday service, we're going to have a Seder meal. And so that's a little different for us, but that'll be Thursday night. And so instead of having supper and then going into the sanctuary for Maundy Thursday, we're going to have a Seder meal, and that's going to be our time. So anyways, just want to kind of give you some heads up of this. We'll follow this. There might be one or two changes, but this is pretty solid. Yeah, we'll have Holy Week lunches. We just won't meet here. Well, we have like a little devotional, but we won't be here. We're going to follow the same pattern where no individual Bible or no normal Bible studies that week. We're all in the fellowship hall, and it's all based around Holy Week and the lunches. Well, so if you fancy yourself to be hungry, you can come at 11:30 and eat, and then we'll have our there's normally a little act of music or worship, and then there's maybe like a little study or something for about 30 minutes, and then you can eat again. So, but 11:30 to 1-ish is roughly, but the devotional piece and the music piece begins at noon. So. But yeah, and you don't have to eat. But it's normally pretty good, so it's not bad. All right. So any other questions about our schedule? And then Kathy will, as always, keep us updated on how things are going. All good? Can I race? All right. So we're today 7 last sayings, and we begin with Luke, and this is going to be our full passage. So it's Luke 23. Verses 26 through 34. And the reason why people study the seven last sayings, one, obviously it's during the Passion, the Passion Week of Christ. So this is he's coming to the end of his life. He is aware of that. So we normally study these in Lent. And Lent is that there's two major preparatory seasons in the church. And the first one is Advent, and that's the 4 weeks before Christmas. And that's a little celebratory more than anything else. And the idea is, what do you do in those 4 weeks so that when we get to Christmas, we embrace the incarnation as if it is for the very first time. So we sort of want to put ourselves into that first century and hold together this idea of Christ coming. And then at the same time, Christ's return. Both of those are Advents, first Advent, second Advent. And so we devote a whole season to that. It didn't sound good, did it? I think that might have been in the kitchen. So we're going to assume they're okay, right? And and the idea is we want to prepare ourselves. It's important, we want to get in a right frame of mind, cultivate a right disposition of the heart, because normally that season is incredibly busy. Christmas for many people is the busiest time of the year. It's celebrations with family, with friends, possible work. You've got end of the year items, if depending on level of employment and job and things like that. So it's just packed with so many things, and they're all really, really good. And if we're not careful, we can get to Christmas and it's like, wow, let's just kind of move on to something else and keep on going. So that season of preparation is really, really important, spiritually speaking, to sort of center ourselves again, and one of the major theological tenets of the New Testament, incarnation, God breaking in a very unique and specific way, in a very definitive way in Jesus Christ. God and human coming together to, there's so much that's part of the incarnation. So then the next major, it's not major, it's just the next season of preparation is the time of Lent, which we are in. Last Wednesday, we began Lent with Ash Wednesday, and that's sort of marking yourself to begin a season of self-examination. You're very inward-looking, and the idea is that we want to do things, again, cultivate the right heart, a right disposition. We want to be in a right frame of mind, all leading up to Easter. And because Easter is definitive for us, right? This is what uniquely makes Christians Christians, is the resurrection. So it's also a busy time of year, spring, and it's, Henry Nouwen, who I think was just a very gifted writer of the last century, and he said Lent is this battle between winter and spring. And you think about it. Now, of course, not here in the South. We're like instantly in summer, right? We get like 2 days of spring and then it's just all gone. But, in its traditional sense, there's this sense of darkness rolling out, and then all of a sudden life is booming and beginning, and so and it's this struggle. And I've always appreciated that imagery about how we see Lent. Because we want to be in the right frame of mind so that when Easter comes, we receive the resurrection as if it was the first time, and we embrace it, and we not just honor it, but we wrap our hands around it, and because this is what makes Christians Christians. And so we don't want to approach it as if it's just something that's just normal. And because it's not, it's very unique, and it's distinctively what is the cornerstone of our entire belief. So so for some of you, you take on additional things, disciplines. Maybe you take on a time of fasting, or maybe you take on a time of study or prayer. Many in our staff, we're taking on silence and solitude. And what it's like to just not speak for a period of time every day. and then to maybe be quiet in a way that we can, hear from God. And because if you're used to, think about all the noise that exists in your life. It's everywhere. And normally what happens if people aren't talking, we have levels of anxiety. For instance, y'all go to lunch. I know some of y'all go to lunch together. Don't say a word. Order your food, sit, look at each other, just, or pay attention to all the sounds that are going around in the restaurant. Eat your food and then leave. All right? Some of you are already shaking your head like there's no way in the world we're going to do this, right? But there is something to the fact that, don't do that for lunch, right? So, but what if you, 30 minutes a day in the morning or whatever, no TV, no news, no phone, no iPad, no noise. And you just sat for a period of time to reflect. What's probably going to happen since it's new or different for the first 10 or 15 minutes, you're going to feel like, what's going on here? It's like the world has stopped spinning, right? But eventually you push through, and then sometimes that's a great place to be in a right. It helps us be in a right frame of mind, maybe a clarity of thought. And this is what I wrote this down this morning because it's what I've been praying in Lent, and this is just my own personal prayer. And so during Lent, what I'm praying for is a calmness of heart, a clarity of mind, a resolved spirit, and a graceful eye. And so a lot of times you have to work at that, and so disciplines are important. So Lent, sometimes in Lent we take on extra disciplines, or we adopt a period, a practice, or we fast, give up things, for a period of time. That's fine. Our house, you cannot give up coffee. We tried that. Brooke and I both tried that for Lent, and then we took on fighting. So we figured it was better to give up fighting and to embrace coffee. So. But I'm dead serious. We tried that for Lent, and boy, that was the longest 40 days. And Sundays are the Sabbath time. So on Sunday, we were just drinking coffee like it was water, And but needless to say, so Lent, we do something in Lent because we want to really be in a right frame to not just enjoy Easter, but to embrace it in all of its fullness, to the best of our ability. And so often during Lent, we'll take on these 7 last sayings of Jesus, particularly, not just because it's part of the passion, but whenever someone is about to die, and they know they're about to die, they do not waste time. They don't. Some of you have watched that either in a spouse's life or a friend's life. When they know that their time is limited, they do not waste words, and they do not waste minutes. And so the fact that Jesus was aware of this, and we know this in the upper room in John, I think it's John, it's either 13 or 16, somewhere in that neighborhood, where it's one of the most profound verses in the New Testament for me, in the New Testament where it says, Jesus knew that all authority was given to him, and that he came from God and he was about to return to God. And so the next thing he does, he washes the disciples' feet. But what I love about that passage in John is that John gives us insight into what Jesus was thinking and what he knew. And he knew his time was limited. And of course, that just began a number of hours in his life. And so he did not waste his words, and he did not waste his minutes. So with that being, and what was true in Jesus is also true in our life. We don't waste when we know that they're limited. So the 7 last sayings, the reason we study them is because they really are that important. You get to where Jesus is prioritizing what he wants people to know. And particularly his disciples or the people around him. And so it's good for us to study this from time to time, just to sort of kind of get back into maybe into the psyche of Jesus and what he was, he was wrapping up, tying things off before his death, and then ultimately his resurrection. And so we do our best in trying to find the right timeline, as in which saying was first. But you have to take that with just a little bit of degree that there might be one saying that took place over another, because we don't have like a clock where someone's saying, okay, at 15 till Jesus said this, and at 20 till he said that. But for the most part, we biblical scholars, we think we have the right order. But if not, we do know it's the 7 last sayings either way. So the first saying that we're going to look at is today's passage, and that has to do with Luke chapter 23, verses 26 through 34. So if you would, either at home, you can look on the screen, or you can turn in your own Bible if you're here. If you would turn into that scripture. And so if somebody would, if somebody would read, beginning in verse 26, it's not much, it's just a handful of verses. Somebody would read the passage for us. 26 through, what did I say? 34. All right, thank you.
As they led him away, they seized Simon from Cyrene, who was on his way in from the country, and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large number of people following him, including women who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the barren women, the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' And then the mountains, they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if men do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. And when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots.
All right, thank you, Becky. So this is, again, we're right at the beginning of the crucifixion. I know some of you have traveled to Israel, and you know there's one historic, they think, by the 4th century where they think this is located, and then one, I think, from the 1800s, another area where they think this actually took place. But this idea of the skull, and then we've got some other characters that show up in the passage. I mean, we meet Simon of Cyrene. There's also some women that are following along, and we have an idea, at least who some of the women, who they were. We know it's plural, but we also know that Jesus addressed them with a certain title, Daughters of Jerusalem. And then, of course, you got the place, Golgotha, or the place of the skull. And then the surrounding context, at least from the larger text, which would be all of chapter 23, we know that there are at least 2 criminals, right? We do know that at the beginning of 23, Jesus is engaged with Pilate, and to some degree there's a crowd to some degree, but definitely some of the leaders of the synagogue that are also there. So there's, we know, where's my stuff? We know the criminals were there for sure. That's what the specific passage or pericope mentions to us, but we can, even though Pilate's not there, we know that Pilate was at least part of chapter 23, and then leaders, or to some degree, some of the crowd that's there. And it could be that when Jesus addressed this group, he's really, referring, to all of them. We don't know yet, but we just know that it's not just Jesus and the 2 criminals. It's Jesus and the 2 criminals specifically here, but the surrounding context is we've got these other people that are a part of at least this scene, either just before it or part of it. Simon would be from what is now modern day Libya, North African. That's the area that he would be a part of. In Luke, in the second half of the Gospel of Luke, which is what we call the book of Acts, in chapter 2, Luke mentions that there were devout Jews in the city, Jerusalem, from Cyrene. So, and it could be that Simon is one of those. I think some of your versions might say something like coming from the country, depending on what what version you have. But we do have this person, and what's he doing? Or what does he do? He carries the cross, absolutely. And in Luke's gospel, and it's true of some of the other gospels, but it's definitely true in Luke's gospel, carrying the cross is a phrase that denotes to some degree, some level, or at least a signal of discipleship. If we were to go back and look at all of Luke, and maybe we will in the fall, there are different times where Jesus is preaching, and he likens a life of following him to someone who takes up their own cross. I mean, y'all are familiar with that language, and there's two in Luke's Gospels. There's two phrases that are used to mean discipleship. One is the idea of picking up or carrying a cross. The other one is sitting at his feet. And but it's interesting that he is carrying the cross. On the larger scale, this could mean some level of interest or following of Jesus, or it could just mean literally he carried the cross. And because what was true in the Roman world is crucifixion was the dominant means of execution. It was capital punishment in that day, and it normally was preceded in some level of flogging. So it's not just Jesus was flogged. We do know about that, but the other two criminals, you can assume that they were flogged too. Maybe not to the same level that Jesus. Well, the crown of thorns and some of that other stuff would be unique to Jesus, but it wasn't. It was very common for criminals who were sentenced to die via crucifixion to be flogged ahead of time, and in crucifixion, I don't know if you've ever read or studied anything. That is a horrible way to die, because you dive, actually say, you eventually just wear out your muscles and you suffocate. And they, do not remove your blood or your organs. You're either tied or nailed to, most likely the cross that Jesus was nailed to looked something like that. It might have had something extra because that's also where they put a sign, but many of the crosses that people were executed with or on during the Roman day look something like that. And so a person would, sometimes there might even be like a tiny little seat, not a lot, or maybe something that has where they can stand just like this if they weren't nailed. But the idea is you were up there for days. So, it's not, Jesus, what's interesting about the Gospels is that the Roman soldiers actually are a little bewildered by the fact that Jesus died so quickly. Because most people who were crucified, it went on for, a few days at least. And your body was there eventually till you gave up and you could not pick yourself up enough to expand your lungs. And so you collapsed on yourself. That's how you died. And if that wasn't enough, it's not like they had a team of people that would come and take you down and, clean up your body and put you in a cave or anything like that. You were there to rot or to be bird food. And it was normally on a roadway that for the highest level of visibility, because this was a deterrent to the people. And so they didn't take you out back and crucified you, behind the house. It was normally, like 185, just outside of the city, and so that people coming in and out of the city would see the people that are crucified. They would ridicule them. They, sometimes would throw things at them. There's all kind of things that would go on in this. And you were seen strictly, just as a criminal. And it was a very painful long death after floggings or beatings, and and then eventually you were left to die, and it was to take place over, the better part of days, and then left to rot. So this is the scene, or at least the beginning of the scene that we do know from our readings of the gospel. It started with floggings for Jesus after a trial. Simon of Cyrene does carry the cross for some, either Jesus couldn't, or we don't really get insight into, other than he was, the text leads us to say he was made to do it or compelled to do it. And eventually he's led on to Golgotha, outside of the city, to endure a very painful death. We know that he was not tied, he was nailed. But along the way, we have this group of people, these, what is that, verse 27? Is that right? Yep, the women, and there followed him a great multitude of people and of women. So we have this great multitude of people that could be some of this. It could be just, those that are rubbernecking, you know how it is when you pass a wreck and everybody wants to look and see. It could be some people that are just wanting to see what's going on. But we do, it's a multitude of people, however that is, we don't know. And that there are at least a group of women, because they are highlighted by Luke, and Jesus addressed them, which is, and what does he say? Well, yeah, he calls them daughters of Jerusalem, which is, where does that come from? Old Testament, yeah, exactly. Handel's Messiah, right? Isn't Handel right? No, but it's Old Testament. Daughters of Jerusalem. Gene, you had a question?
Not really a question, but we studied earlier that the daughters of Jerusalem were the little settlements outside the walls of Jerusalem.
So the comment is the daughters of Jerusalem were part of the settlements outside of Jerusalem. Perhaps. And because it also comes from Old Testament passages, particularly Hosea. And so we're going to look at that in just a second. Isaiah and Hosea is where this passage that Jesus, so daughters of Jerusalem could be the settlements outside. He is outside of the city. It says, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, which is odd because children in the Bible are seen as what? A what? A blessing of the future. It's because for people who can't have children, in the Old Testament and New Testament, they unfortunately were seen like something must be wrong in order for that to happen, and often something must be wrong between them and God. Right? So, we're not, thankfully we don't have that same assumption, but in Old Testament, very much so. And so that, it's interesting that Jesus said, don't weep for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. It's interesting that Jesus would say that. And then he says, and he gives some four, all right? So now he's about to substantiate what he just said. He's going to give you the reason. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, blessed are the barren in the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. And then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the wood is green, what happens when the wood is dry? What is that about? I'm glad you asked. So before, I want you to look at one passage. One is Luke 19, verses 41 through 44. So turn back a few pages. This will give us some insight into what's going on, at least in the mind of Christ. Yeah, Luke 19, verses 41 through 44. So if somebody would read that for us. All right.
As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it and said, if you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you.
So we do get some insight into at least what's going on in the mind of Christ, not just in chapter 23, but also in chapter 9. As Jesus made his way into Jerusalem, Jerusalem is seen as to some degree, the symbol for all the people, like for all of the Israelites. I mean, it would be like if we Washington D.C. It would be the same thing maybe in our day. And so when Jesus approached the city, even though he's talking specifically about Jerusalem, he's making the comparison like Jerusalem is a microcosm for people who are missing what God is doing in Christ, in Him. And the daughters of Jerusalem in the Old Testament is a title that is often used to describe that same concept. Now, it might be part of the actual settlements outside, but in Isaiah, daughters of Jerusalem is the title that Isaiah gives for the people or who have either missed it and now they're returning. But it's a symbolism for God's people, for Israel, and so here Jesus is addressing them. But the fact that he uses this title is very interesting because it harkens back to the Old Testament, where people were in, we just talked about Daniel, and you had all the different bondage, enslavements of the people of Israel. When Isaiah uses the words or the title daughters of Jerusalem that we know about, say, from Handel's Messiah, it is Isaiah's message that people can return home. And you descendants of Jerusalem, now your punishment is over and you can return back home to the city. And Jesus is using this Old Testament title as sort of symbolic for the people who have, for whatever reason, have missed what he is doing. And what he does, he quotes Hosea. So turn now into the Old Testament, Hosea chapter 10. Yeah, but it's a lot of testing all your knowledge today, right? Yeah, some of you are going, where's Hosea, right? So, yeah, exactly right. It's right after Daniel. Good, yeah. So yeah, we're going back into the Old Testament, right close to Daniel. So Hosea is a prophet to Northern Kingdom, and verses 1 through 8. This is what Jesus is referring to, and I want to also stop for a minute. One of the things that the New Testament does, even though Hosea is talking specifically about a time in Israel's history, it's not uncommon for the New Testament to use those same passages, but to see them or to interpret them now through the lens of Jesus. All right? So, and that's common for them. It's not a misuse of the text. It's just the way that they used Scripture, in that day. And so even though Hosea is talking about back, around 900 BC, before Israel is the northern kingdom is destroyed by the Assyrians, it just wasn't uncommon for them to take either a passage from, say, like Hosea, or a passage from Joel, or for Isaiah. And even though Isaiah or Joel or Hosea are speaking about a certain time in Israel's history, because of Christ, they easily see that through the lens of Christ and use it as it's them and us at the same time. So Israel is a beautiful vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. And then notice, so Hosea is describing a time in Israel's history when they are prospering, in the fullness of that word, financially, however it may be, but what's going on inside of their heart? Verse 2. Their heart is false. Hosea chapter 10. I'm sorry. Did I not say 10? Okay. Yeah, Hosea 10, 1 through 8. Sorry. I've been up since 4 today, so y'all get me on the best day of the week. So, so Isaiah is describing, and what you're going to find in this passage is that the people, on one level, the country is prospering. But on the inside, they are not prospering with God. All right? And so this is what Isaiah is describing. So, Israel is a beautiful vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars. And then notice how it changes. Their heart is false. Now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will break down the altars and destroy their pillars. For now they will say, we have no king, for we do not fear the Lord. And a king, what could he do for us? They utter mere words with empty oath. They make covenants. So judgment springs up like poisonous weeds in the furrow of the fields. The inhabitants of Samaria tremble for the calf of the Beth-aven. Its people mourn for it, and so does it idolatrous priests, those who rejoice over it and over its glory, for it has departed from them. The thing itself shall be carried to Assyria. Again, Hosea is prophesying about the coming destruction of the northern kingdom as tribute to the great king. Ephraim shall be put to shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of its idols. Samaria's king shall perish like a twig on the face of the waters. Then verse 8, the high places of Aven, the sins of Israel, shall be destroyed. Thorns and thistles shall grow up to the altars, and they shall say, and notice where you've heard this, and they shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Which is exactly what Jesus said. And so what Jesus is doing by quoting both Isaiah and Hosea is that he's taking this title, Daughters of Jerusalem, from Isaiah as a it's a symbol for all of Israel. And just as in Isaiah's day, on the Hosea's day, it's a lot of Hoseas, right? So in Hosea's day, everything on the outside looked wonderful. But on the inside, it is not. And because of that, then they missed what God was doing. And so Jesus is making the same comparison to what the people in his day are doing with him. On the outside, it might look really good. But on the inside, you've missed the coming of God's anointed. Same thing as Luke 19, 41 through 44. Jesus is about to enter the city, and he weeps over the city because what? You're missing the appointed time of God's Redeemer. And then when he sees the people who maybe it's this group, it's a large group. It's not just the women, but it's the women and the group, and they're missing what's going on. And so Jesus is, he's acknowledging that through the use of a little bit from Isaiah and a little bit from Hosea. And the destruction of Israel, because back in Hosea, the destruction of Israel, because they have substituted faithfulness to God with idolatry. And so Jesus echoes Hosea, and Jesus anticipates that those who have rejected God's salvific purpose by rejecting Jesus and his divinely ordained mission will at some point follow the same path. Now, what we do know in 69 AD, so not long, maybe just 30 plus years, Jerusalem is utterly destroyed, wiped out by the Romans. So it's interesting here. All this is leading up to, this is like the eighth thing, right? So we don't study that much. So But we're getting close to the last scene, which leads us to a break. So let's take about a 5 to 7 minute break, and we'll come back, and then we're going to look specifically at the last scene. Well, welcome back. All righty, let's come on back to the good part of the passage. And that is the actual, the one of the last sayings. So we have the setting, the different people. Jesus is on the cross, and there are two criminals that are on different sides. Yeah, we're not in Hosea. Now we're back to Luke. Luke 23. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Luke 23. Sorry about that. So now we're going to look specifically at verse 34. 32 tells us that Jesus is with the two criminals. They're being put to death. They're at the place of the skull, so we've got all the setting that we need. And then we have the beginning of, or at least one of the last sayings, verse 34. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." So what are we to make with this? It's fairly straightforward compared to the daughters of Jerusalem and the hills and the rocks. And, it's interesting that he starts with, so, Father, Abba. Okay? And Abba is a word of intimacy. And he doesn't address, there are other words to use for God. He could use Jehovah, he could use Elohim, he could use Yahweh, but Jesus used a different word, which is Abba, same word that when he was teaching the disciples how to pray, our Father, Abba, it's a term of intimacy, which is interesting that Jesus used that term, and yet he is in this humiliating condition where he is suffering on a cross. And so there's this whole thought that says, well, when Jesus is on a cross, God turns his back from Jesus because the sins of the world, of all humanity, were placed on him. And because of that, God can't stand to look. But yet, this is a word that describes intimacy with God. Connection with God, not separation. And just as interesting that Jesus used that word. During this passion, this time of his death, Jesus continually affirmed the benevolence of God, not only for himself, but for others, even those who were responsible for his own crucifixion. But it's interesting to use this word, which is a word of intimacy. It's a word of connection. It's a word of closeness at a time when he is suffering. So there's a couple of questions I want us to think about. One is, can we see the closeness of God in suffering? Because most of us don't care. How many of you like suffering? Not a soul, right? And sometimes in suffering, what do we do? We question, not affirm. Often it's question, where is God in the middle of this? We're definitely not affirming God is in the middle of it. And so, what about this whole, what some people would call a theology of suffering, and the fact that God, not the cause of it, but God could be in the middle of it? I'm sure you've heard the name Charles Spurgeon. Charles Spurgeon said that when you have to carry your cross, he carries the heavier end. He carries the heavier end. So this, I mean, listen, by no means am I trying to suggest that God is the cause of any level of suffering. I mean, I don't think that's ideal for God. But the idea that even in the face of suffering, that God could be with us. That is the latter part is what I'm stressing.
I know I couldn't have gotten through my husband dying
Sure.
without strength.
Yeah. So you think about that where it comes to, I mean, death to me is, grief is like a monster. I mean, people who tell you that grief is no big deal, they're either immature, ignorant, or out of touch. That's exactly right. I mean, and the thing about grief is that it comes in cycles. It's not a one and done deal. It's a cycling, and it sort of moves like this. And there are times where you feel like it's okay, and then you move back a little bit, and then you move forward. But even in the middle of that, I mean, the idea that God still could be present in all of that. I mean, I think this again, people who know that their time is limited, they don't waste their words. They choose their words wisely. And so there are 4 or 5 other titles that Jesus could have stressed, and yet he uses a word of intimacy, a word of closeness, and even a word of connection. I think that's just something for us to contemplate. Because if everybody's going to have different levels of suffering, right? I mean, nobody gets out of the world. I mean, nobody gets a free pass with it. And for some, it's the seasons where they're in it, it's heart-wrenching. And what's interesting to me is that God doesn't shy away from it. Even when we push against, don't know, whatever it may be, question, wonder, even curse or cry out. He does not. I can promise you, he's big enough to handle that. And I think you get a little insight, at least from. I think it's significant, and it's interesting to me that even in the face of suffering, the word that he used to address God. Now, some could say, well, this is just Jesus, and Jesus had the right to do that because he's Jesus, right? Okay, I mean, but I don't think Jesus did anything that was outside of a teaching moment. So it's just something to think about.
Did you say he used the same word, Abba?
Abba. That's this word here.
Lord's Prayer?
Yeah, so the word Father in the Lord's Prayer is Abba. Mm-hmm. Same word for here. And not Elohim, which is the word for God, not Jehovah, not Yahweh. I mean, those are other words that are used to have a certain definition, connotation when it comes to an aspect of God that the word means. Here means intimacy. That's exactly right. Intimacy, closeness. This is the way that a child addresses their parent. Mommy, or daddy. It's masculine, all right. But I mean, but I'm making it user friendly for everybody. The idea that it's the way that a child, whatever the name of intimacy that a child has for their mother, their grandmother, their granddaddy, their daddy. That's the word that Jesus is using here. So whatever your grandchildren call you, you can play around with that a little bit.
Did Jesus know ahead of time that God was going to be using his death and crucifixion as our means of salvation?
Yeah, so the question is, did the Father know ahead of time that Jesus...
Did Jesus know?
Oh, did Jesus know ahead of time that his death would be, I'm going to use some different words, would be sacrificial for humanity? I would answer wholeheartedly yes.
I thought so, and it seems to me like maybe his calling God Father, Abba, might have been all right, I've seen this coming, it's getting started.
Yeah, it could be. Yeah. So I mean, but it's a word of closeness. So, I mean, I think Jesus was the most self-aware person ever, and operated fully in the knowledge of identity and purpose of life, identity of Son of God, and what that meant in purpose. I mean, that's why we started with, I think it's the John 13 or the 16 passage where when Jesus knew that all authority was given to him, I mean, you know, what did he do? He washed the disciples' feet. That was an object lesson. I mean, we can read in the Gospels, you know, very early on, there is an identification, I would argue, that Jesus knew his purpose. I mean, when he begins his ministry in Luke 4, he picks up a scroll from Isaiah and says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me," and then it's to preach the good news, to proclaim release to the captives, for the blind to see. And then there's this latter part, that's a different part of the book of Isaiah that says, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, or something along those lines. And I mean, all of that is messianic. And so I think he was fully aware of who he was and what his purpose entailed.
And so he would feel close to God.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. But even in the face of suffering too, not just on the high points. Because what's interesting, also in the face of suffering, what does he say? Forgive them. Who's them? And these are linked. Not here, but in a different, in a different area, different place. So there was awareness of Jesus understanding that his death was not just average, that it was for a specific purpose. But here, or likewise, you know, similarly, you have, you know, maybe what that means, what that purpose really is. And so you've got this idea of forgive them. Now, them could be the people, you know, daughters of Jerusalem, Pilate, you know, just the people specifically in the text. I mean, that's, I mean, because he sees his life in something larger than just the immediate, as his life and purpose is for humanity in general, I think you could draw a broader meaning of them. But the idea of forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, here's what I want us to think about, because this is almost in the realm of like, thank you, as that applies to me, but I don't want to pass it forward. Because most of the time when it comes to forgiving other people, we're happy to take forgiveness, but granting forgiveness, well, that could be a little different. Because this reason, do they repent? Do they say they're sorry? Do they even know what they did? Maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Notice that this forgiveness is not contingent upon anything, which is scandalous in our mind. I mean, just think about the magnitude of this, all right? His suffering specifically caused by them. And yet, the words out of his mouth are, don't hold it against them. Not just I forgive them, but I want you to forgive them. And so forgiveness implies a different state from the person who grants forgiveness. So here it would be, don't hold this against them so you see them as if they didn't do it. That was on point, let me tell you. So, exactly right. Gene, I'll be ready in like 5 minutes. If you can work up another one, I'll be good to go with that one too. So, so the comment is, this is the power of God working. So is it limited just to Jesus? I'm asking.
Would the them, could that be us too?
Yeah, I think you could have a broad understanding of who them, you know. Obviously, the people who heard it would be the immediate audience. But I think, you know, because of Jesus' understanding of identity and purpose, and that it wasn't just for the immediate audience, but a larger understanding of what his purpose, his identity and purpose was to create and do, then I think you could have a larger understanding of them to mean all humanity. Yeah, exactly right. So, like, you know, this is everybody. But, you know, I think we're okay with them being universal, everybody, or, you know, all, you know. I think the real struggle for us is that, you know, there should be some, you know, some levels of contingencies. Well, they're not asking.
I know, but he's saying he will forgive them. I mean, he's saying you should forgive them, but you don't have to repent or.
Well, I'm asking you. So,
Shane, you could be forgive me.
sure.
I don't know what.
Well, but then it becomes I'm acknowledging my own shortcomings. We don't know if they acknowledged anything. So I don't want you to. We're also going to run out of time. So I think it's both and to some degree, right? So the forgiveness of God really is not contingent upon anything other than Jesus Christ. That's exactly right. This is the defining moment when a person does acknowledge, does confess, does repent. It takes objectively what God has done in Jesus Christ, and it moves it into something subjectively. It's like I can tell Brooke I love her. That's objective. Now, until Brooke takes that in and allows that to be a part of her life, it still will remain out here. And so the act of confession, the act of repentance are not prerequisites, but they are helpful in allowing God's work to work its way into the depths of a soul, if that makes sense. But I don't want you to spend a ton of time on that, because what's crystal clear in the New Testament, both in the Gospels and in the New Testament, is that because of this, Jesus is the judge. All right? I mean, that is without question. And so how God chooses to dispense his grace is up to him. All right? So just allow it to stay inside of the realm that it needs to stay in. I want us to think about, if this is how Jesus operates and we're followers of Jesus, how do we dispense the grace that has been given to us by God to other people? Because we are commanded to follow and to forgive. And if this is some level of at least a pathway for us, or an example, then can we dispense grace that we have received from God to another person without contingencies? Yeah. So the comment is, we can at least remember we're supposed to. Yeah, I mean, I think it starts there. But seriously, because forgiveness is vertical. Reconciliation is horizontal. And forgiveness is always something that one person grants to another person, independent of what that person does. Reconciliation is what a person does that does have contingencies. You have to want to be reconciled. You have to work towards reconciliation. But forgiveness is independent of any contingency. And so just as God has forgiven us without contingency, then as followers of God, we are to forgive others without contingency. Now, it's better if we have them. I'll grant you that, all right? Because then forgiveness and reconciliation can kind of work together. I mean, it is good when there's contrition. It is good when there's apologies and people, and coming together and things of that nature. But forgiving another person is not only possible, but it sits solely in the discretion of the person who is granting the grace, difficult as it may be. I thought somebody had a hand. And it is hard, all right? Listen, I'm not. Yeah, so forget, I wish that never has been uttered from a pulpit. Because that is heretical. The act of remembering, the act of forgetting will cause you to remember. It's just so backwards if you think about it. And it's not logical. It's like, I'm going to forget. Forget what? Oh, the event. You know what I mean? Let me try it again. You can't. The great thing about the work of God in the life of a person in this process, and that's what I mean by it's vertical. It really is between God and you. It might involve another person because it's normally tied to an event. But the act of forgiving of another person is independent of that person. We don't like it. I'll be the first to admit. Because the reason why granting forgiveness is so difficult is because there's something inside of us that wants retaliation or acknowledgement or something that verifies or at least justifies our pain. You with me?
It took me a long time to realize that forgiveness is a place.
That's right. Yeah. We get twisted with it, right? That's a great Greek concept, right? Because we think the more we hold on to it, the more that kind of sends these cosmic zaps to them. And they could be carefree. And sometimes they don't know, right? But for us, it's like, I'm going to hold this, and by holding this, then somehow that's going to hurt you. And what it does, it hurts us.
The thing about it with me is that when, we have to forgive in order for God to forgive us.
Yeah, so you're correct. So the comment was the command to forgive, and that perhaps God's forgiveness somehow is related to our forgiveness. The teaching by Jesus on that is, I don't want you to see it as legalistic. What I want you to see is as the flow of it. God has forgiven, so as followers of God, we want to forgive too. And that because God has forgiven, then that creates the means through the work of the Holy Spirit so that we can follow God in this way. If this didn't happen, I would say this is darn near impossible. Because it really takes a work of God in whatever mysterious way of God changing a heart in order for people to grant forgiveness. That's just where I sit on this.
Do you think
It's too difficult.
something that you say, and you say it, and then you grow into it?
Yeah, so I'm going to use the word progressive. I think it is progressive. And I think some of it I think there's a path to forgiveness. The first couple of steps, I would argue, is what you do as a person. You have to, you really do. So saying it, you have to win the battle of the will. Do you really want to forgive? And if you don't, then that's fine. Just acknowledge it, because it's to say that you want to when deep down you know you really don't. You're not going to have the energy, my term, the willingness to even want to walk down that road. And so the first, if someone comes to me and they say, Shane, I'm mad at Shane tell me how to forgive Shane. The first question I'm going to ask you is, do you really want to forgive Shane? And I think you need to take 6 to 9 months to really consider it. I mean, you know, and I know I'm not trying to diminish and take out of the command to forgive, just because the Bible says you are to forgive, but if you don't want to do it, it doesn't matter what the Bible says. It will not work inside of you. I mean, and that's not shortchanging the Bible, right? I'm just saying there has to be a willingness to want to do that. And then the second thing I think you need to do, and this is very, very painful, is you got to dig up some of that stuff that you've buried. And counselors are helpful, therapists, a good trusted friend, things like that. And that's a little bit of a process. It's going to be very painful. Because Hebrews, the book of Hebrews calls forgiveness a root of bitterness. Calls the unwillingness to forgive, that it can be a root of bitterness. Well, where do roots live? They live under the surface. And they grow until they're uprooted. And it's been my experience that if the event is tied to someone that there is, deep love and, history with, then the larger the roots are going to be. Because in a relationship, what makes a relationship thrive is that you lower your protective walls so that you bare your soul each to the other. Well, and then when that's ruptured, it's like, well, nobody told me. I didn't put up my wall, so I took the whole blow myself. So, you have to acknowledge that. And that's painful. And the reason why it's so painful and so scary, because you feel if you let go of the bitterness, it's like they get away scot-free. It's not. That's just what we think. And so it's tied to our identity. We see ourselves to some degree through the lens of that painful event or incident. And betrayal's very difficult, because it's relational. But after you win the battle of the will, which might take some time, you really do, Lord, I'm not going to run away from the event. I'm going to acknowledge it as painful as it is. Very painful, very emotional, right? Then I think that's like plowing up the ground of your soul to then allow God to come in. And so the next act would be, or the next phase or work would be, Lord, I'm not running from this. It's uprooted. I want you to heal me from the inside out. Will not forget it. But what happens is, over time, through this work of God, it's just not, it's not filled with toxicity anymore. And it's like little by little, this is a terrible analogy, and especially just before lunch. So here's your image when you go eat. It's like lancing the boil. All that nasty infection and pus, it's just out it comes. Well, what happens? You still got, still there, but it just doesn't have the same venom. It doesn't have the same infection. And so that begins this process where even when you do remember it, it just doesn't have the same control. And so your thoughts and feelings that are tied to that event, they just don't become roots anymore. And so then when you're going to remember it, it's just that you remember it and it doesn't control you anymore. Now then, if you can walk through steps of reconciliation, by all means, but that might not ever happen, because that actually does involve the other person. And I think, as often as you need it, you just go back and work the steps. But time doesn't heal wounds, right? But time working this process, like as in overtime, it's all that infection just comes out. But you got to be intentional with it. But I think it starts here.
But love doesn't come flowing right back in.
No. So again, and so the question is, love, or the comment is, love doesn't come flowing back in. I'd want us to be clear about what we mean by love, right? So the idea of, love in, I hope they don't die, or I don't want them to die anymore. Okay, that could be the first step. The next step could be, all right, if they don't die, at least not the painful life. They could have just an average life to, you know what, Lord? If you're going to bless me, then bless them too. Yeah, I'm being a little, so reconciliation would be sort of like the reestablishment of a loving relationship, okay? But that might not ever happen, and that's like 15, 20 steps down the road. So see that they're different. But in restoration, what can happen is that relationships can be restored, first with forgiveness, second with reconciliation. And just as forgiveness is a little bit of a process, the reconciliation is a little bit of a process. Imagine two people that are across the Mississippi, but they're on the bridge. And they begin that process of walking back together, right? Well, it could be a while before they really get to where they're close again. But that's an independent process that's separate from forgiveness. But forgiveness has to happen if there's ever going to be any level of reconciliation. And, so for me, it would be, all right, Lord, I want to favor good things. I want to lean into good things happen to them. And if that's all that it gets to, then that's enough. It might not, I'm not saying you're going to go on vacation with them. Maybe. But that might be down the road. But it's got to start at least somewhere. And the first act is working through steps of forgiveness. All right? All right?
How does God feel about us if we are not willing to forgive somebody?
So the question is, how does God feel about us when we are unwilling to forgive someone? So would you think, I'm asking, do we think that our unwillingness to forgive is going to change God's love for us? Yes or no? So to use the parental analogy, which is one of the dominant ones inside of the New Testament, do you stop loving your children when they act in ways that might not be the most loving? So I get the idea of wanting to pinch their head off. Yep, that's that's got some other Greek words in the New Testament, right? So I don't think it changes the affection that God has for you. I think what it does is we continue to live less than what God really desires. If that makes sense. It's like when you go to great length to prepare this wonderful meal for your grandchildren and they want fish sticks. or chicken fingers, right? And it's like, wait a minute, what you think, really is, there's this whole world that's available to you and you're living beneath it. I think that's sort of what it's like. All right, go in peace. Next week, we're in 23, so we're going to just keep reading in Luke 23. Amen.